Now, gla1ve is the in-game leader with the most majors won in CSGO history. He has won 4. The most anyone else has won was 3, which was obviously Pronax. He is the only one to have won 3 that did it back to back to back, which is impossible. Yes, Fallen did 2 in a row. Pronax did 2 in a row. He has won 16 LAN trophies in his career and a few online. He was famed as a fragger as an IGL, like way above the level he should be, bearing in mind he was in entry roles. Like, most famous example being when he was the MVP while being the IGL at IEM 14 Beijing, which was in late 2019, where they just won. I think it was the one they won without dropping a map, and he was just unbelievable fragging level. He is a contender, if not the front runner for greatest in-game leader in CSGO history and Counter-Strike as a franchise. Maybe one day I'll do a video on the greatest overall in all the franchise. People know his glory days with Astralis and the major wins, understandably. Some have maybe heard he had some brief success in 2013 with Western Wolves, especially obviously if you listen to people like Pimp, but few seem to actually know what his down years were like and his time in the wilderness. Maybe they've heard that story about, oh, it was like his girlfriend or something at a LAN, but they seem to think it was like a few months, or it was a year or something. I don't think they realise, like, this guy at one point in time just was not going to ever have top success in Counter-Strike beyond a brief period at the very beginning of CSGO. It was so unlikely he would come back and actually be the greatest leader of all time and win so much. So let's get into the gla1ve you don't know. So gla1ve was born in June of 1995, which means that early in his career, when he was going to these source lands, he was actually already going to lands when he was 15 years old. He was playing with people like CSGO and Rogger. Obviously, Rogger's the coach of OG now. CSGO was, well, not his teammate at Astralis because obviously they'd already replaced him, but one of the great early Danish players of CSGO. He wasn't the in-game leader though this time. I think in these teams like Rogger or Hunden were his leaders early on. He was about 17 in 2012 when Source ended, because it ended like around the summer or so. So a little bit after that, he was 17 and then he went into CSGO. In CS Source, he played with a bunch of good players like Nille, Nico, Pimp, who later became his Western Wolves core, and some of the other names that, well, were around the Source scene, but aside from CSGO, people aren't really going to know them as much in CSGO. When he was winning those championships with Astralis and in his GOAT phase, that was when he was 21 years going on. And obviously he was like, they won in early 2017 and the end of his period as a top IGL, I would say, is the end of like 2019. So we're talking about what, in 2019, he would have been 24. So actually his main success, 21 to 24. We'll talk about the rest though. So the key thing here is, you have the pre-Western Wolves days. So in Source, okay, he's already gotten to a good level. Remember, he's mainly just a fragger at this point in time, a skilled player. Then, because he's played with people like Hunden, coming into CSGO, he takes the jump and he becomes an in-game leader. And so you go over to here, and you have, like, he's at the first DreamHack Winter, which is one of the events famously won by NiP. He was also at Thor Open, an event won by NiP. When he was in this team, Copenhagen Wolves, it wasn't the one you're thinking of later with Fetish. He was playing with people like Hunden, I think was still might be his in-game leader at this time. Nico with a C, the one who was his AWPer later in Western Wolves. SMF, who was just a veteran of the scene and was around in early CSGO for a few years. So then along comes this era when he changes to the team Annexis. Now, in Annexis, this is already interesting because in this team, Rogger was the in-game leader initially. Then they had CSGO as their in-game leader. But then what they did was recruit gla1ve and Nico to come into the team. And at that point in time, you made the lineup that became Western Wolves and had their finals runs against NiP. You had Nico as the AWPer, Nille and MSL as like entry and support, Pimp as like just a star fragger and just guy getting a lot of good stats. Nico was the main star of the team as the AWPer because he's a very, very talented player and he didn't practice very much. I heard something mad, like when they were in like Copenhagen games and he was wrecking everyone. He'd played like 30 hours a week and he was, or like 2 weeks or whatever, and he'd only played something like 800 total hours in CSGO. What an absurdly talented individual. And obviously gla1ve became the IGL at this point in time. But the funny thing is, they were already in X's briefly actually. They only got to go to the HK LAN where he beat out the other Danish teams and esports Heaven Vienna. which was a top tournament. He came second to, this is the first tournament where they came second to NiP. And believe it or not, after that, they actually got booted from the August and Nexus. They didn't leave, they got booted. Because what happened was, the Nexus org at the time, I think it was Mouse Sports, had let go of their UK roster, who'd finished like top 4 or something at the DreamHack Winter Tournament. And they'd picked up this UK Mouse Sports team of like Rattlesnake, who everyone thought was better at the time, because, I mean, they'd already had this one fluky run. And actually, obviously, it ended up being a bit silly. They should have stuck with these players instead of letting them go to Western Wolves. So over they went to become Western Wolves, which is a lineup then people will know. They'd already had the finals run at Esports Heaven Vienna, including like beating Very Games. Famously, they beat Very Games here in a very close semi-final. And Very Games themselves had beaten the Na'Vi team that had come in. They played NiP in the finals. Unsurprisingly, one close map on Nuke. That'll be interesting for later. And then got smashed on Inferno. Spoiler, this is when NiP's in their 87-0 period. No one beats them at this point in time. So then you came to the Western Wolves one. And at the next big LAN, Copenhagen Games, they also made a finals run. Again, with some big results. Like you'll see over here, they lost to Virtus Pro, which was the lineup with the CIS squad that would later stop the 87-0 of NiP. Was a very skilled lineup with like Dossier and Dren, etc. Then down in the lower bracket, they did an epic run where they beat out like the Mouse lineup was all right. Fnatic was actually a pretty solid set of players at this time who was having results. Then they beat Very Games, smashed them completely on Inferno, which was big time. Very Games was the second best team. And then they played VP, beat them, got the revenge on Dust 2. They went to the final, and in the final, they unsurprisingly got beaten by NiP, but spoiler, everyone got beaten by NiP. This is when they were in their 87-0 run. After that, they had some other tournaments that were like solid, like you have a third place here at Mad Cats Birmingham. But the thing is, you go back to Denmark and you lose in Danish lands. You're losing to teams like, because Fnatic was Danish back then. These are Danish lands that you're losing at this point in time. So that's pretty alarming, right? But you whatever, you qualify for DreamHack Summer, still a big event at the time. At DreamHack Summer, you go 5th to 8th, but that actually belies something that happened at this tournament. Because in this tournament, as if to show the potential of gla1ve's calling style and his team, who wasn't as skilled, by the way, as the Copenhagen lineups, the Copenhagen Wolves lineup that had like Dupree and Device and Cajun B eventually and Wants and some of these players. This was more like tactics, and gla1ve himself was fragging very well, as I'll show you in a minute. But in their group, they won their group over NiP. This is one of the first times NiP lost a map after the 87-0 streak was broken. 2 months earlier, Virtus Pro had stopped the 87-0 streak. Obviously, at that point in time, NiP had never lost a map at all. After that, by the way, they would still win all the tournaments. Like, they'd only lost that one LAN ever. So you come onto this one, and in this group, in the second game, so the winners match, Western Wolves, after closely beating this Swedish team, I think it's the one that actually had, Pronax in it, they play in the winners game, NiP, on Nuke, which was NiP's best map and their home map. NiP was 38-2 on LAN on this map, had beaten all the greatest teams in the world. And Western Wolves smashes them 16-2 with a 13-2 first half, and then just a shot out on the T half. And this was the old Nuke, the OG Nuke that was mega CT sided. So that was an exceptionally impressive performance. And in this particular performance, as you can see, who's the one fragging the fuck out? That's right, it's gla1ve, who has a 25-7 scoreline. Then the Nilla guy did what? The Nico guy wasn't even that good in this match. He was all right, but he didn't have to see much action. Most of the players on NiP just get absolutely fragged, including Forest and Get Right. So this was a big-time result, but as was the problem with Western Wolves, some of their players lacked the motivation. Nico was as a fragger, and then obviously you had these issues with gla1ve. He was someone still adapting to the role, and his mentality was always something that was, quite frankly, a bit questionable. Some of the players in this team maybe didn't practice as hard or want to practice as hard or be as punctual, etc. So after that, you win the group. You get to go, in theory, that means against an easier opponent. So they actually got Epsilon, who obviously ended up making the final because it was the lineup that, without Pronax, these players were the Fnatic core later that would become the champions with Pronax later in the year. So, sadly, in the first round of the playoffs, you have a close enough series, but you just get beaten by them. And then they do go on a nice run. They go all the way to the fact they even beat Kenny SSL DLC. So, fair play. They were on a heater at that tournament. That's how they made their name. People like JW and Flusher. So, you already could see the potential was there. You've been in finals. You've mixed it up with NiP. You've had this epic result. But after that, if you look, then you have another LAN. You go to EMS Major Series here. but you lose to NiP. No shame in that. So 5th date's no problem there. You had to play against an IP. You go to Mad Catz Invitational Cologne, the LAN part of it, but you lose to Fnatic. Fnatic was a team becoming better and better. This is the time already where they've recruited the players from the Epsilon lineup. So it's no shame to lose to them. But again, you are slipping down your level a little bit with some of the issues I'd heard behind the scenes from people like Pimp. He mentioned it in an interview with me back in the day on Gamers. And that's it. That's the last LAN. So we go from the first LAN final is in February to the last LAN played with this lineup is only in August because there was issues with the team and it broke down over time. So then you go after Western Wolves. Now we're already starting the wilderness years, guys, or rather the irrelevance years. You're at tournaments, but you're just irrelevant. So you go and look. He then played in a team called Eyes on You. You don't need to know about that. There's nobody you'll care about there. Then he played with Vikings, which was like Barbar and some other Danish players you won't know. Then he played with Oxorn, which had Cadian on it, but Cadian wasn't that famous a player at the time, not particularly well known, except in the Danish scene. Then he played with N Faculty, which was, interestingly enough, the team he went to the first ever major with. Look, he went to the first major and he finished 9th to 12th. So let's get into this, because here's something you won't know. Did you know gla1ve played at the first 4 majors in CSGO and never got out of groups once? And he actually had some legit teammates, although we'll get to it. A lot of them underperformed at the majors, quite frankly. So we'll go to the first ever major. It was in November of 2013. And as you can see, his team and Faculty finishes second to last. They don't get out of their group. You go look at their group. Their group is actually one where it was plausible to get out. Like, it's not the easiest group necessarily. I'd say in terms of, like, if you want to have, like, an easiest chance to make it out, you probably want to be, maybe you could argue this one. Like, this is some solid teams, but aside from this one, NiP, the rest are more like they can all contend for the second spot. The problem with the group that N Faculty's in is Very Games at the time was the best team in the world and won a bunch of the recent lands. Complexity was Sean Gares, Nothing, Heko, Semphis, which were like a solid team internationally. And even the Zapsol guys weren't a joke. That was like Cadian, AZ. Like, these were like some known players who came out of the BYOC qualifier. But even so, you're going to have to beat at least Complexity or a solid team to get out of here. And spoiler, N Faculty is not able to do that. By the way, the lineup of N Faculty, let's just go and look, is gla1ve, who's the IGL, I'm assuming, Carrigan, who at this point wasn't an IGL in his career, Cajun B, who's a strong fragger actually, and would later get back into the Dignitas, later to be Astralis core, Pimp, who was his old mate from Western Wolves and still a solid player, and had played in Copenhagen Wolves not that long before, but he got replaced by Device or whatever when he came back. And Rals, who everyone, like, for this year and the next year would always say was like an up-and-coming talent and should, like, be one of the next players to watch out for, but he just never made it. He was even playing recently in CSGO. And what's silly is this. They shouldn't even have been in this major, gla1ve. The only reason his team qualifies, look, is for his team finishing first at DreamHack Valencia. Now, why didn't I mention DreamHack Valencia? Oh, that's right, because this was a stupid rule Valve made somehow, where they allowed a qualifier from a DreamHack event because it's a DreamHack major. But this isn't the lineup that played at that tournament and won it. That was a Swedish lineup that did that. But for some reason, they get to just, the org gets to use the spot for the major. And so gla1ve got to play this major. At this major, his team gets thrashed by Call on Inferno. They don't even get a CT round. In the elimination match, they beat the Zapsol guys of AZ, etc., coming out the BYOC on train. Very nice. 10 T rounds on the old train is no joke at all. It was a CT-sided map. Then you go to the winners match. The problem they have is, cause Call did that bullshit with like Nothing and Swag doing like the fake on Inferno and won the match. They had to play Very Games. And if they'd played Call, I'd like to see the rematch there. I'd like to know what happens. But we never will. Very Games was way better than them and beat them convincingly on Dust 2. So that's it. He's out of his first ever major. After that, the team's fairly irrelevant, although they do go and win like a Danish land, but that's like a team where, like, you can imagine the absolute elite teams weren't there. You go to the next year, he's into a team called 3D Max, so we'll go. They come through the closed qualifier, and he gets to go to the second major, EMS1, not ESL1, EMS1, which was a different brand. It wasn't ESL1. It used to be the sub-brand to IEM back then, because Carmack and ESL didn't believe Counter-Strike had what it took to be a tier 1 esport anymore. That's actually something you can go look up in interviews, etc. So he goes to the second major, and let's have a look at his lineup again. This time he's with 3D Max. 3D Max is him, Pimp, his mate from Western Wolves, Rals, who he's played with. He's got in Azy from the Zapso squad, and he's got MSL, his old mate from Western Wolves, who wasn't an IGL at the time, was a support player, actually. So he's got, actually, 2 of the players from his Western Wolves lineup, and then he's got some solid young talents in Rals and Azy. And he's come through the closed qualifiers. Okay, he's just qualified online for the tournament. Interesting. Let's see if he can mix it up. We go look at the group that he's in. He's in the group with NiP. So obviously, this is still when NiP is like second best team in the world. They haven't won a tournament in a while, but they're the second best team in the world. You have LDLC, which was the lineup with like Happy and Maniac and Apex and Uzi and Kaylee, the infamous Kaylee, where he may or may not have cheated at this line. I'll probably do a video on that topic one day. And this in this group, like they're like a solid team, but they haven't done anything massive at this point in time. I think they'd had like an all right run at the, I think it was that they, oh no, it was after this they beat them at Cup. So actually they're not even that super duper relevant a team themselves at this point in time. And it's because they'd come top 8 at DreamHack Winter, because they'd been able to take some of the players that had been in, I'm assuming, like the recursive lineup or something like that, that had made top 8. But again, this is how wacky qualification was back then. But not an elite team. Like, this is actually a group, by the way, where it's doable to get out. You got NiP, who's going to be very, very hard. LDLC, it's plausible, though. Later, we found out they got top 8 and were solid, obviously. Vox Eminor, this is when they just got invited from Australia. Chad's team with Sponge, Havoc, Sniper. Before it was the good one. By the way, famously, Havoc flamed me because I said that his team had been invited to majors. Oh, that's weird. Invite implication, because he's talking about like one where they won a qualifier or something. It's almost like the guy was just a bearded bozo. Don't ever step to me with beards, homie. So in this one, it's actually quite underwhelming, I have to say. This is one where I would have thought they would be able to. I wouldn't have picked them as a team to get out over LDLC. At the time, they weren't that relevant lineup. But you look back now, and actually at this point in time, it should have been plausible. So you see, obviously they get smashed by NiP. No surprise there. NiP's still extremely good. This is actually when Fifth Lauren was briefly calling. Then in the losers match, you just take care of Sponge's Vox Eminor. They were a top team. Then in the decider match, this is really tragic because look, it's an Inferno game. It's a 16-13 decider. gla1ve actually had some nightmare decider ones where he could have gotten out over the bigger name. First half, you get 90 rounds on Inferno. You've got to think you're going to win then. But I will say, this LDLC lineup with Happy wasn't a meme on T-side. They did do real tactics. Maniac was a good entry with Apex. They actually were a solid squad. Kaylee was a star player at the time. And they managed to win, unfortunately, 10 T rounds, including winning second to last round to actually seal the match and take the top 8 spot. Now, if 3D Max had made it through that match, they would have gotten to play VP and won the event. So they would have probably gotten rolled. But that's a bit of a sad one. You could have gone further in this one. After this, you go to Copenhagen Wolves, but you only finish 9th to 16th. You go back home to Denmark and do some nice stuff. But then when you get to the next lands again, it's ESL1 Clone. You're at the next major. And what's that? He's already playing with Copenhagen Wolves lineup again. So it's going to be a different lineup again. gla1ve played in a lot of different lineups, guys. Now, in this lineup, it's an interesting mix of players, right? He's with Carrigan, who isn't an IGL at this point in time. He's with Cajun B, who's actually like a very strong player at this point, but had been kicked out for like whatever drama out of the Dignitas lineup, which was the Astralis core, and they'd replaced him with Azy, which did not work out. And Cajun was nearly always good when he got kicked to get his motivation back. And then you had his boys, Nico the Orper, and you have Pimp, his old guy from Western Wolves. He's playing with a bunch of his guys who he keeps reuniting with, and a bunch of different Danish talent. Cajun B's even a top talent from the region at the time. They come out of the European qualifier. Okay, this is all looking good. Surely this time they're going to get out of groups, right? So you go and look. He's in a group, which I will say, admittedly, is a hard group if you're going to be like a 3rd or 4th seed. Because in his group, he has the LDLC team, which is the same lineup from before. And by the way, they almost made the finals and could have won this event with Apex playing out of his mind. And had just earlier won that LAN. I think they won that LAN where it was against the Shocks Epsilon lineup. Or was it actually Epsilon that won that? I thought it was actually LDLC that won that. Yes, they won DreamHack Valencia, a tournament that had like Epsilon of Shocks carrying the fuck out of everything, Hellraisers. This was a solid team. And you also have Na'Vi. Now listen, this isn't the later Na'Vi who's always elite. This is the Na'Vi. This is the year they're coming up with Guardian Hard carrying them. But still a solid enough team. They've already done things at this point in time, like win that Star Series in inexplicable fashion over some of the best teams in the world. And then you've got London Conspiracy, which is like Rain and the gang. So let's go and look here. It was like Rain, PRB, Polly, Rubino. You know these players if you know old school Norwegian Counter-Strike. So a solid enough team. This is obviously after the G-Finity EG3 event where London Conspiracy had showed some nice results actually in the group stage. So okay, it's a little bit of a tricky group, but it's not impossible, especially because we're talking BO1s in this tournament that you can get out, but it doesn't happen again. They played nrv in the opener and get absolutely rocked on Inferno. Then they play London Conspiracy. They actually easily beat them on Cash. This is when Cash was a new map, by the way. Then in the decider, another heartbreak. A 17-19 overtime loss to Na'Vi with Zeus and some legendary players like Guardian. And you look, in the first half, you only win 5 CT rounds on Dust 2. Very T-sided map back then. But then you get 10 T rounds of your own. You go to OT, but unfortunately they beat you in OT. And as you'll see, in this game, gla1ve again is fragging, even as the IGL. He actually gets more frags than everyone except Guardian. And then Edward had the same amount on Na'Vi. And Guardian, unsurprisingly, carries its Dust 2. Back then, if you put Guardian on Dust 2, he will absolutely smash you at this point in time. But you'll see, his stars don't turn up. Like, what's Nico doing? What's Cajun B doing? Pimp's just all right. This is the problem, unfortunately, for gla1ve at this era. But the point is, I want to make this point in this video, it doesn't matter how good an IGL you are. If you don't have the attitude, people won't buy in and play for you. And if you don't have the talent and the talent performing, it doesn't matter how good an IGL you are. Now think of the careers of MSL, Alexi B, Existence, etc. After that, you can see it doesn't really matter if they go to the lands. Aside from Danish lands, nothing's really going on here. ESWC, 9th to 12th. Not particularly impressive. You go to the next LAN, the next major, his 4th major. He is on Copenhagen Wolves again. He's still got Pimp. This time he's got Intensky. He's got Kjærby, young Kjærby at this point in time. Pretty young Kjærby, who later obviously would play with him in Astralis and be his major MVP at the first tournament. He's got Cadian again. They come through the last chance qualifier. Now here's the key thing. This is another major gla1ve technically shouldn't have been at. Should only have played at 2 majors at this point in time. Because at this major, that last chance qualifier spot came in part because of the match fixing stuff. Where what happened was Titan had the LDLC spot, but Titan obviously got Kaylee banned 2 weeks before the major and were just disqualified from playing in this and weren't even allowed to play in the last chance qualifier. And then the Epsilon people... see, took over this spot. Epsilon, their spot got disqualified because SF got VAC banned as well. And so as a result, they held a last chance qualifier on LAN in Sweden at Inferno Online, and 2 teams made it out and then played the match to decide who got to pick what group they went in. Flipside Tactics not have played. It was actually people like Twists, Berg, who beat Mike Northam back then. And then Copenhagen Wolves is this lineup here. This time, because he gets to pick his group, he picks the right group. He actually picks a group. We have Dignitas, the best Danish lineup, who were pretty good. You have Penta, the German lineup, who are all right. You have iBuyPower, who've just kicked out Dazed and Steel. So actually, they've made their lineup weaker. They had like, whatever, like Swag and... no, it wouldn't be Swag. He was already there. It was like Nitro and who else was it? Nitro and Desi. Oh yeah, I forgot about Desi even existed. They brought them in instead for that spot. And so this is a group that you should be able to get out of. And actually, they go 0-2 in this one. It's really sad. Because in the opener, they get smashed by iBuyPower and Nuke. Now, iBuyPower did have a lot of skill. Nitro was a fragger back then. Then you go to the low bracket match, and it's a close game against Penta, but it's on Dust 2. It's a classic match for map for Germans, if people don't know back then. And you lose, you only get 5 T rounds, and then they just get their 6 rounds within, 13 rounds played on T side, and that's it. You're out of the major. You've blown another chance to make top 8. So there were some chances here, a couple of close games, and just some chances, like this one was a big one, to potentially get to top 8, but it never happened for gla1ve, actually. So then comes the infamous incident where, well, why doesn't he keep playing after that? Because look, boom, it's over. It's over after this tournament in Copenhagen Wolves. And after that, we're off into the wilderness and fucking irrelevance. Doesn't matter until you get all the way to this team, until you get to the Team X/SK/eventually Heroic, over 1.5 years later. Because what happens at this tournament here, the infamous Gaming.dk CSGO tournament, GDK. So what happened was, gla1ve's team, and this is a tournament, by the way, like a studio set up with like a stream, it had like DDK and I think Risk commentating it. Like this was a meaningful tournament to attend. And what happened was, the team had something where even though they'd agreed, like, we're going to take, like, one person's girlfriend can go and be the manager and stand behind us, but only one person's allowed in. I believe Pimp told me something like, they'd even told gla1ve, like, don't bother coming if your girlfriend has to come. But he just, like, demanded his girlfriend, who at the time, by the way, says her name here, was one of the most infamous people in the scene for having dated loads of pros or went on to date loads. I forget which it was, but an infamous figure in that regard. So you can even say, like, that's one of the reasons I've always thought gla1ve had some things weren't quite screwed on properly in his head. He always had something a little bit off, minus the GOAT period with Astralis. And he basically just demanded that she be able to be on stage behind him. Now, they had a big dispute about it. They played the tournament, even though they won, let's see, they actually won the tournament. They won the whole thing, including over MSL and Hunden's team. He gets kicked from the team after this. He gets fined almost €242, which time's no joke. And he eventually just gets booted out of the team and he gets a 6-month ban because he apparently threatened to boycott the LAN if he couldn't take his girlfriend into the venue with him. Because the problem was Nico, who was the star player, already had his girlfriend registered as the manager so they could stand there. Because, by the way, that's what players were like back then. They were registering their girlfriends as managers so they could stand on the stage behind them, even though they're not managers and they're in no way coaching them. And by the way, if you're one of the other teammates, what if that person starts talking while you're just fucking... Mate, this is ridiculous. But that's how silly the Danish scene was back then. The Danish scene always had a problem with, like, toxic attitudes and people being BM to each other. It was a very strange place in that regard. So he gets removed from the team entirely, like, the next month. Now, what happens the next year is he does try with an ESC lineup of Exa, Colon, the guy people thought cheated in 1.6, maybe he did, Crazy, Tensky, so he has Tensky back. He goes to the LAN qualifier. This was the first proper LAN qualifier where all the regions got combined. I love this. I wish this came back instead of RMRs, so you could be legit instead of some of those BS American and Oceanic teams that get to go. Like, if Greyhound can actually win a LAN qualifier against the top European teams, who aren't yet that year, fair play. They deserve to go. I don't think they would, quite frankly. So at this tournament, with his ESC team, they just get bounced in 2 maps. They lose to the Dignitas team of Fetish and MSL and Pimp, etc. 16-11 on Mirage. In the lower bracket, they face 3D Max, which was the Finns of Natu and Disturbed, etc. Korn. They lose 16-8 on Mirage, and they don't even make this major. He'd made 4 in a row, 2 of them by dodgy methods, but now he doesn't even get to go. Doesn't even get to be at a major. And after this, he is playing with lineups where it's not even worth going into. Look, he's still playing. He's still playing Counter-Strike. Don't worry about that. But look, he's playing. Look, he's going up to here, into May, with this Team C play. Then there's a big gap for LANs. Look at this. And online tournaments. All the way, that's like 6 months, guys. 6 months to November. Then he's back with teams you've never heard of. Back in Reason, X-Reason. He's playing here. Still with these nobodies into 2016. Remember, 2016 later on is when he gets back in Astralis. So how does he get into Astralis is what you got to ask yourself, right? He's playing with Copenhagen Wolves again. Let's go look who's in Copenhagen Wolves with him. Hunden. I believe Hunden became his IGL again. I think at this point in time, he was just fragging from what I remember. SMF, really old school player. Percy, been around for donkey's years. Snappy, at this point, an irrelevant player, but the player who used to be back in 1.6 in Roskilde Ravens with Freeze, etc. So, okay, they're around, but they're not doing that much at these tournaments. These are qualifiers. Notice these are all online. Goes to a LAN, Assembly Winter. Top 4, lose to one of the Ents lineups from 2016, which is the Finns, but not the really good ones. Okay, more online stuff. LAN, Copenhagen Games, obviously classic Danish event. 2016, as far as I remember, was when it was like, yeah, it was the second tier teams mainly at this event. And what do you know? Yeah, they win their group. But they get immediately bounced by a Swedish mix, which is... I mean, aside from Fetjes, who's barely known, in HS, does anyone even know these players? I don't think so. And HS only became famous the next year, by the way. So this is not a good era. This is actually dire, guys. Loads of these online tournaments, just irrelevant. Goes to DreamHack Open Summer. This was the one, if you remember, that was won by Immortals over NiP, and Astralis blew it in the semis against NiP, with Device going ham. Doesn't get out of the groups. He's on SK Gaming at this point in time, who've brought him in. He's not the IGL, I don't think, at this point in time. Let me just double check that, actually. Was he the IGL of this team? Believe it or not, I actually think from memory, I could be wrong here. I think it might have even been Moddy who was IGL, but it's possible it was gla1ve that was IGL and briefly here. But the key thing is, after that, He stands in for ESL1 Cologne for Astralis, but not as IGL. Carrigan's still there. The reason he stands in is because Kjaerbye had been in the Dignitas lineup before and had played like the RMR or a qualifier. So he wasn't eligible, even though he'd signed with Astralis already and played at like DreamHack Summer stuff. He wasn't actually eligible to play in this tournament. So they had to bring someone in who wasn't already locked into a spot. So that meant gla1ve. gla1ve got to come in and replace Kjaerbye. So in this lineup, Carrigan's the IGL. They've got Device to Pre. Obviously, this was the event where also Pre, who had to go to hospital for his appendix. And it was Zonic that stood in, I think, from the playoffs onwards. I'd have to double check that though. Let's just see, shall we? It's worth knowing. Looks like it's actually from the decider match onwards. But this was when Device mega carried. The team actually made it to the quarters and lost narrowly to VP in overtime games. And VP, by the way, could have won this event. And I'll tell you right now, Device carried the fuck out of this series, even though they lost it. Look at this. Plus 25 with 94 ADR over the season. By the way, gla1ve's plus 4 with 84 ADR. He frags more than anyone except Pasha on VP. He's doing more than Snacks. Like, gla1ve back then was a really serious fragger. In fact, let's look at that, because obviously this is where he wasn't like properly in Astralis. We'll just go back to early on in his career. So before he becomes an IGL, look, he can frag out big time. Then when he becomes the IGL, still a very solid fragger. Look at this Copenhagen Games on the one the way they went to the final, plus 69, 70. Now, you do play some bad teams, Breeden, so look at that kills per round. Then you keep going up. Okay, it goes down again. He's the IGL, but the summer one, the one where they thrashed him 16-2, 0.85k PR for an IGL. That's bonkers. Yeah, he has the downtimes again, but you know what? He'll keep coming back. Like this major. Look at that major that was a flop, but he had 0.81. Copenhagen Games. Big time result, even though the team doesn't go that far. Yeah, ESL Cologne back to whatever as an IGL. You go up, yeah, there's times it's not that good. There's times it gets really strong again. When he doesn't have to be an IGL and he gets to the Team X, which becomes heroic, he is fragging again. Look at the kills per round at this time before he goes to Astralis. Then in Astralis, yeah, he was an entry, he was the IGL, and as you know, his numbers went down. So you go and you look, he got into this team, Team X, which was basically the team that became heroic. And the key thing here, they'd already become heroic here, was they went to the Power Lantern. And in this team, Snappy is the IGL and gla1ve is the secondary caller. That's a key thing. He wasn't the IGL at this point in his career. So at this tournament, they win this LAN, a Danish LAN, that features Team Dignitas, which are the guys that would like win Epicenter later with MSL, etc. Astralis, who's Carrigan and all those guys who've been like top 8 at like a major, etc. Obviously he's just played with them, etc. They have Rogue, which is like Cadian, and Maniac was in it, and Tensky, and like a bunch of OK players. They actually win this LAN. They just win it. Now, they lose to Dignitas in the group stage, but then in the playoffs, they beat Astralis 2-1 on LAN. Not a great performance by gla1ve, though, but they beat them anyway in a LAN. This is one of the tournaments that contributed to Carrigan getting kicked later, by the way. And then in the finals, they beat Dignitas of MSL, really good one with Config and Magisk, etc. They beat them 2-1. With an OT first map, admittedly. And in this one, gla1ve top frags. Not the whole server, because Config was there, but he top frags his whole team and everyone except Config. He has a plus 11, 93.4 ADR. Now, he's not the IGL, but these are still monster numbers. This is very impressive stuff, guys. So what happens after that is this team's still a solid team. They go to Northern Arena, Toronto, come third. DreamHack Bucharest, I think that means they didn't get out of groups. They're still like a solid team. Lose to Envious, no shame in that, obviously. You know, it's 2016, but Envious has still got some good players at this point in time. He plays for Denmark in the World Championships because some of the top players didn't play. You go to the League of Sharks LAN where they lose to Dignitas, who was the best Danish team at the time. And then what happens was he gets picked up by Astralis. And at his first LAN, they come semis. They almost beat SK. It's a really epic game there. Then obviously after that, they come second at E-League. They win ECS, and the rest is history. You know the rest after that one. You know what an amazing player he was. But the key thing is, you didn't know all the rest of that about gla1ve. You didn't know the times when he had solid players and he mixed around and he kept changing players. And he himself was bouncing from squad to squad to squad. And he was at majors. Sometimes he didn't even qualify for initially. And then sometimes he was close to getting out and he was fragging out sometimes. And he was a very skilled player for an IGL. And sometimes his tactics were good, but did everyone buy in? Did everyone who knows, right? The point is, if you only look at the best period of gla1ve, you're going to think he's unquestionably the GOAT. But you have to look at his whole career. It's not only your prime. And quite frankly, some of this, you can argue his prime as a player was even before this time period.
Hey guys, this is Pimp here. I got another little trick for you guys. I heard about this channel on YouTube that has a lot of good analysis on it. You know, a lot of good points to be made. And fuck, I did it again. It's just Thorin's stupid YouTube channel.
As Mary J. Blige said in her track, All I Need, you're all I need to get by, which is the case for me and my Patreon community who support this channel and these videos. Some of them include Theogony, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Ahmed Hadjou, Joseph Adcock, Tosh, Bot Pounder 420, Thooorin, Animosity, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Goh, Yurka, and a special thanks always to the main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to ask a question in my regular video AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out who upcoming guests are. Maybe you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content, or you want to take part in one of those longer esports discussions with me where we go all over the place. Well, if any of those grab your fancy, put your money where your mouth is, join the Illuminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.